So we're all used to those lists of the 100 greatest books of literature that you must read. And I do actually quite like those lists. They can be very useful. They can be a great guide and compass to your reading journey. But if, like me, you've read a lot of these lists, they can get quite repetitive. Usual suspects always crop up. Whether it's Pride and Prejudice, Hamlet, David Copperfield, all the same novels always cropping up. And that can be great, these novels are important, but sometimes it can get tiring, and sometimes maybe you've just read them all, so you might be looking for something else to read that's still worth reading, but just doesn't always crop up on these lists. How it works is I'll take a very well-regarded classic, and then I will swap it out for something that is less known. Either it will be a lesser-known work by the same author, or it will be a book that has a similar style, genre, or theme that I think makes a nice contrast from its well-known counterpart. Do let me know in the comments as well, how would you swap these books out yourself? And if you've read the books that I've suggested, let me know how you think they compare. Starting with the big man himself, and that is Shakespeare and his most well-known history plays, Henry IV, and we're going to be swapping them out for his least well-known and least well-regarded history plays, Henry VI, parts 1, 2, and 3. So this is 3 recommendations here. Now I do feel like in general, Shakespeare's history plays are less well read these days. They don't seem to be as popular as the tragedies or the more romantic plays, but I do think that of them, Henry IV is usually the one that's held up as the best. You have Falstaff, who is one of Shakespeare's great, bawdy, fantastic characters, and he really does drive the narrative in those stories and is a big standout. On the other hand, Henry VI is usually seen as a bloated, turgid, slog of 3 very long plays which have lots and lots of battle sequences bogging down the time. Also, the characters tend to speak in very long-winded rants, which can get very tiresome. Even with a very compelling actor or actress, it can still get like that. So why am I suggesting these? Well, because I watched these plays recently, all 3 of them. It was the BBC adaptations of them that they did for television, and I was completely blown away by them. Yes, it was a bit of a slog to get through them, but I also just found them really entertaining. And I do think that one of the issues with these plays, and maybe why they're slightly less rated than some of Shakespeare's other more concise plays, is because of the length. You really have to do all 3 plays, and you can't really do that, over a few nights. Someone's not going to come to the theatre 3 nights in a row, if they can even afford that, let alone having the time. Likewise, I do think there are a lot of extended rants in these plays that could really be cut down quite substantially. Also, I don't know how well they would read on the page. I think some of Shakespeare's plays stand up very well on the page because really it is the story that's told in the prose that matters. Whereas with the Henry VI plays, it seems like violence is a key driving feature of the plays. They're really spectacle focused, which I think actually serves modern audiences quite well because we tend to be a bit more spectacle focused, I would argue. And so they do quite well in a stage setting because you actually get a sense of the violence of war, which runs through every single play. Every single play is just full of constant battle, squabbling lords, back and forth. I mean, it's very Game of Thronesy in that regard. And it's the thing that really kept me and my partner watching them going, just the extent of the backstabbing and the fickleness as well of these nobles. What I also found interesting about the plays is that, although it's about Henry VI and his reign, Henry VI is an interesting king, because unlike, say, Richard III, who is this, Machiavellian figure who the whole play centres around, Henry VI is, he's quite shy, he's quiet, he's reserved, he's quite religious and devout, and he wants to just sort of be a good, nice, happy king sat on his throne, praying to the Lord every day, reading his books, and unfortunately he's surrounded by terrible, horrible people who are completely power mad, including his wife Margaret, who is a fantastically camp, ridiculous character and has a great arc throughout the 3 stories. When you first meet her, she kind of comes across as this naive princess in the first play, in part 1. In the second play, she's like this, megalomaniac, plotting and getting angry at her husband for being such a weak man. And then in the third one, it's her downfall and she's just completely going off her head. And she also appears in Richard III. She's usually cut from Richard III, but even in that play, she is again she's completely lost it. Now, I do think there are some problems with her character. She is probably one of the most ranty of the characters, but the actress who plays her in the BBC productions just chews every single scene that Margaret is in. So she did a fantastic job, and I didn't find it too much of an issue with the ranting. So if you want to get into Shakespeare's history plays, I would recommend watching that production at least, if not reading them. I think they are quite underrated. I think they're really enjoyable. If you just want to get a sense for how brutal, the feudal system was, I think these plays do a really good job of that. And they've also got a lot in them. They've got comedy, whether it's something like Joan of Arc and the French from the first part, and the second part you have this like Irish, I think, a rebellion, and it's just ridiculously comic where they start going around and burning books. All this stuff is there. Obviously you have tragedy because people are dying all the time, and you've got bloody vengeance and plotting. So it's pretty much got everything you would want. So definitely, if you haven't, check out these 3 underrated Shakespeare plays. Now moving more to the present day, next up we have Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy, and I'm going to swap these out for the first 2 books in Mervyn Peake's Gorman Guest trilogy. Now, the influence of the Lord of the Rings certainly can't be overstated. The whole world building that Tolkien does in his books have influenced pretty much anyone who's writing an epic fantasy today. Not only that, but Tolkien to this day is also one of the most detailed world builders there has ever been. He created his own languages, his own cultures, his own history, huge history to his books, and also managed to tell a compelling story with interesting characters within that world. Now, despite the fact that Tolkien has had a massive influence on fantasy, the reason why I've picked Gorman Guest, which on the face of it seems quite different from The Lord of the Rings, because while it is a fantasy, it's a fantasy in a much more subtle way. It's not necessarily about big quests and lots of different races and all this kinds of stuff. But why I chose it is because it is a fantasy story, but it's a fantasy story of a very different kind, and it's one that I think has also had a very subtle influence and large influence on modern fantasy as well. Think of people like Neil Gaiman, Clive Barker, even Stephen King to some extent. I think all of these writers who toe the line between sort of gothic, horror, and maybe more character-focused fantasy, and fantasy that's typically grounded in the real world rather than in a fantasy world, they all, I think, follow Mervyn more than they follow Tolkien. And in some cases, like Neil Gaiman, I think he freely admits that Gorman Guest and Mervyn Peake was one of his big inspirations. I also think that personally, if I was going to pick one of these 2, I would actually say that the first 2 books of the Gorman Guest trilogy are better than Lord of the Rings. While I do think that Tolkien can't be faulted for his amazing world building, I've never been all that compelled by his characters in the story. I do think that they have a good bond and all of this stuff, but I do find his characters somewhat simple. And that's not necessarily a problem, but I do prefer characters with a bit more about them. And I do find that the characters in Gorman Guest really come alive, especially Titus across the 2 books. Now, in the first book of the Gorman Guest trilogy, Titus actually doesn't appear all that much, he's a baby, and instead we focus on the Groan family. Now, the Groans are a noble family who are in charge of Gorman Guest, and Gorman Guest is this big, sprawling castle that's like a city in and of itself, and it's completely old and ruined. It's like a labyrinth, and it's falling under the burden of years and years of tradition, which everyone has just scrupulously followed throughout all this time, to the point where most of the characters, especially the older characters, whether that's the current Lord Groan, who is incredibly depressed and miserable because he's under the weight of all of this pressure of following the traditions, he's basically just a robot or feels like it, or his wife, who is one of the most bizarre characters I've ever come across. She is this incredibly large woman who spends lots of time lounging around, and she's obsessed with cats, and they all follow her around like a little army of cats. And she has a very interesting arc throughout the first 2 stories, but I won't spoil it because it would mean telling you some of the character fates. But all of these characters are very interesting, almost Dickensian, and watching them progress in the first story and in the second is fascinating. Now, in the second book, we have Titus coming into his own, realizing the pressures of tradition, and ultimately trying to reject that. And in the background of all of this, we have this guy called Steerpike, who is he begins in the first book as a cook's servant, I believe, and he decides that he wants to plot against the Groans and take over. And then in the second book, his plotting takes off and he becomes a big antagonist in the story. It's really interesting stuff. It's got big themes about tradition and all of that, but also it's got some really compelling characters and a fantastic plot. I really love the ending of the second book, and although yes, there is a third book, unfortunately Peake got ill towards the end of his life, and that did affect his writing style to some extent. But I also think that the first 2 books do tell a complete story, the journey, Titus's journey as he grows up and realizes the way of tradition and ultimately rejects it. So if you haven't read Gorman Guest, I would definitely recommend it. I think that it is just as important for the history of fantasy as something like Lord of the Rings, and I do think that to some extent that influence has been a little bit overshadowed by Lord of the Rings as well. Next up we have, maybe somewhat obviously, Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice, which I'm going to be swapping out with Mansfield Park. So I did my big read of all of Jane Austen's novels last year. I read them all twice just to really get a sense for them, and I'm glad that I did that because when I first came across Mansfield Park, I wasn't all that engaged with it. It was fine, but it was quite difficult, it was quite slow, and I just really wasn't getting on with it. But on my second read, the whole story just came to life for me. It makes for a very good contrast to Pride and Prejudice as well. Pride and Prejudice obviously is Austen's most celebrated work, especially among the normies, and it's a great story. It's a great romance, it's hilarious. You have Lizzie Bennet, who is a great character, a great role model for women. We also have the other characters like Mrs. Bennet, who's hilarious. It's definitely one of Austen's most colourful and engaging novels, but it can also lead to the assumption by a lot of people that Austen just writes fluff. You know, she wrote chick lit, but in the 1700s. But I think that's kind of unjust and unfair to Austen because I think actually there is a lot more to her work than just Pride and Prejudice. And Pride and Prejudice itself is certainly more than light fluff. But with Mansfield Park, we have a much more serious and sober story. First of all, the protagonist, Fanny Price, is much more shy, she's quiet, she feels sometimes like she's not even in the story, despite the fact that she is the heroine. And that already is a big change from the earlier Austen heroines, and from the archetypal Austen heroine, which is usually quite brazen and sassy. Also, the story really doesn't focus so much on Fanny as it focuses on the characters of Mansfield Park, the people living there, the people around it, and it kind of covers this idea of morality and what we should be as people. Should we be like Fanny, hyper-pious and all of this, or should we be slightly more modern like Mary Crawford and her brother Henry? And what's great about this book is that it doesn't feel like Austen is trying to impose any particular moral judgment on the reader. There's just a lot of moral maturity and complexity in Austen in this work, and it boils down to something as simple as the title. Austen's first two books are clearly somewhat moral tales. You know, they have these titles, Pride and Prejudice, or Sense and Sensibility, and it's thematic. And so when we're reading the story, we're being told to see it through these thematic lenses. With Mansfield Park, we don't have this guide in the title anymore. It's Mansfield Park. It's about this place, it's about this people, and Austen, the writer, isn't necessarily imposing any moral judgments anymore. She just wants to explore. And I think that's also part of the reason why the novel can feel a bit meandering, because in a sense it is. It's just exploring the various characters. Now, there are some problems with Mansfield Park. I think that Fanny sometimes does great to follow, and she can be so quiet, as I said, sometimes to disappear altogether. Nevertheless, I think it's a great book and one that's definitely underrated among Austen's canon. Next up we have Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway, and I'm going to swap that out for The Waves. Now, I read Mrs. Dalloway in university in my first year when I did philosophy and English, and it was potentially partly responsible for my dropping the English and sticking with the philosophy. Now, later on I returned to Virginia Woolf and I read To the Lighthouse, and I actually really enjoyed it, and so from there I read Orlando and I read The Waves. And The Waves by far is my favourite Virginia Woolf book, and I think it's probably her most underrated book. Orlando is somewhat more popular now because it's trendy with the whole gender thing. To the Lighthouse is usually par with Mrs. Dalloway, but I feel like Mrs. Dalloway is usually seen as the peak, you know, the first Woolf that you would have to read, and then To the Lighthouse, and then maybe Orlando. The Waves, on the other hand, is a very interesting book. It tells the story of 6 characters, 3 men, 3 women, and it follows them in monologue form from their childhood all the way to old age, and in the case of some of them, after they've passed. And it's a really interesting way to tell a story, just to tell it through these internal monologues. Every character voice feels incredibly distinctive. They all represent a different aspect of a human personality. You have this very maternal figure, Susan, who's caught up with nature, and she lives on a farm and sacrifices her social life and career in order to be a sort of Mother Earth figure. Then we have a character like Louis, who is a working class guy who is somewhat artistic, but because he's working class, he has a bit of a chip on his shoulder, and he sacrifices his more artistic ambitions to become a man of business, like his father. Then we do have some more artistic types. We have the main character, arguably, Bernard, who's a poet, reasonably middle class, and usually he kind of unifies a lot of the themes in the story. Then we have Ginny, who is a socialite, kind of the opposite anti-Susan, if you like. She's very flirtatious. She's all about the body and sensuality and enjoying life. Then we have Rona, who might be somewhat an insert for Virginia Woolf herself, who is probably the saddest person in the story. She's quite isolated from the others. She feels like a ghost moving through life. Very quiet, very disengaged from reality. And last we have Neville, who is an artistic type as well, but he's also a gay man, and he struggles with his sexuality and balancing his obsession and love for men with his passion for art. Now this is a fantastic book, and I've read it a few times now, and I'm looking forward to reading this book every time I sort of move into a different generation bracket, because I think that it's the sort of book, because it follows these characters in this development way, it's a book that will just, my perspective will constantly change on it. I also think that of Woolf's books, it's her most accomplished. Like I said, I wasn't a massive fan of Mrs. Dalloway, but I do think that was because I was too young for the book, and I really do need to go. I think I've said this many times, but I do need to read that book again. And I do like To the Lighthouse, but it doesn't grab me in the way that The Waves does. The Waves has this big, universal feel, because you have all these characters, all these different reflections of a personality, and they're interacting with each other, and I just find it endlessly fascinating. So I would definitely recommend this if you haven't read it, but you have read Woolf's more well-known works. Next up we have Oscar Wilde and The Picture of Dorian Gray, and I'm going to swap this out with Oscar Wilde's fairy tales. So I first read all of Wilde's work when I was in secondary school. I think we read The Picture of Dorian Gray as part of our English Lit course, and we had to do an essay that would look at that work, but also look at some other works in the author's catalogue. So you could have looked at his plays, but I was when I found out that Wilde wrote fairy tales, I was like, that's not something I would have associated with him, so let's have a look at these fairy tales. And I just thought that they were really amazing pieces of work, and I actually would say I prefer them to his plays. Many of his fairy tales are very sad and somber, not the kind of thing that you would expect Wilde to write, because he's known for his wit and just being kind of cavalier, to the point where sometimes he doesn't even seem to have anything to say of substance, and that's part of his charm. But with the fairy tales, I think we get a slightly more serious side to Wilde, which is interesting, because obviously fairy tales typically for children, so it's interesting that he is doing that, being more serious with his stories for children than he is his more adult works. Now I don't really want to spoil the fairy tales too much. They're quite short, so it's hard to really give you too much of the plot without spoiling it, but yeah, I would definitely recommend picking up these tales to see a different side of Oscar Wilde. And last on the list we have Charlotte Bronte with Jane Eyre. I could have picked Anne Bronte, who's usually seen as the underrated Bronte sister, and while I will give a special shout to The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which I do think is definitely worth a try, Agnes Grey, not so much, I actually want to talk about Bronte's final book, Villette. She also has a third book that she wrote in between these two called Shirley, which is probably the most underrated, really, but I think that as something that's worth reading, I personally didn't find Shirley that enriching in comparison to Villette, which I found was amazing, and I would say it's Charlotte Bronte's best book. Villette also is a nice companion piece to Jane Eyre, because both of them focus very much on the stories of these young women growing up and finding their own way in the world in very different ways and with very different personalities. In fact, in some ways, it's almost, thinking about it, similar in difference to Pride and Prejudice versus Mansfield Park. In one you have a more forthright heroine, and in another one you have one that's a bit more shy and reserved. But there are some subtle differences. One of the big ones being that in Villette we have Lucy Snowe, who is, yes, she's a quiet protagonist and a quiet heroine, but she also has a kind of playful wit about her. The story is told from her perspective, and she's writing to the reader and telling you the story of her life. And throughout the story, she deliberately deceives the reader. There's certain characters, for example, and she won't tell you who they are until she specifically wants you to know who they are, so she can be surprising. She also ends the narrative on a cliffhanger. It's kind of potentially quite obvious what happens at the end, and I won't spoil it, but she's constantly doing this throughout the book. So although she is more shy and reserved than, say, Jane Eyre, who's quite forthright, she also seems to have this kind of sneakiness about her as a narrator, which makes her very interesting. Now, Villette is not an easy read. I actually read a part of this book and gave up because it was just incredibly dense and slow. It's a book that really does focus on the internal life of Lucy Snowe and her experiences. And so if you're someone who really wants a fast-moving plot, you're certainly not going to get it with this book. But if you stick with it, it's very rewarding. And it's also very surprising because towards the end of the book, Lucy takes some drug or other, I don't remember what the drug is, and there's a hallucinogenic scene. And you have to wonder, how did Charlotte know how to write that scene? Did she take something by accident herself in life? Who knows what happened. But yeah, it's a very interesting story. One that's definitely a lot of hard work, one that I know a lot of people don't like because there's a lot of hard work, but I think it's worth persevering with. And it usually vies with me with Wuthering Heights for my favourite of the Bronte sisters' novels. Let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these underrated books. Do you think that they're better than their counterparts, or do you think that there's a reason why those are the great ones and these are the less great ones? Also, if you like this kind of video and there's a particular author or book that you'd like me to do next time, if I've read the book that you suggest, I might include that in the next video as well. So let me know in the comments. But that is it for this video. So take care, everyone. Ta-ra.